Howdy, folks. Mr. Reardon here. I'd like to walk you through rhetoric and the rhetorical situation, a couple of the most important concepts that you'll learn in AP English Language and Composition, and concepts that underlie a lot of the other things, the more complex ideas that we'll be covering in this course. So, first of all, what is rhetoric? Well, rhetoric has two definitions, at least as you might come across them in day-to-day language. So, first of all, it means the art of using language, whether spoken or written, to persuade. That is, to convince somebody of something, to to um, to successfully argue a point. Right. Rhetoric is generally done through the use of compositional techniques. Those compositional techniques will be called rhetorical choices in AP English language. Rhetorical choices is a very broad term. It can cover everything from really big, broad rhetorical choices like the decision to use a speech to deliver the point or to persuade instead of using an essay. It could cover the structure of a text. It could cover the use of colors or details in an image. It's a very broad term. And this is in contrast to rhetorical devices, which are still rhetorical choices, but are much more specific. Some things that you know right now as literary terms or literary devices, like metaphors and similes, are also rhetorical devices when their purpose is to persuade. And there are also language-based rhetorical devices like parallel structure that we'll talk about more in this class. So just keep in mind, if the use of language, if any use of language is not ultimately intended to persuade, even if implicitly, right, then it is not an example of rhetoric. It might still have a purpose, right? It might serve to inform you of something, for example. But if it's not intended to persuade, it's not rhetoric. A lot of material we look at in AP Lang will be rhetoric, but not everything. So you'll also hear the term rhetoric used to refer to language designed to have a persuasive or impressive effect on its audience, but lacking in sincerity or substantial meaning. You might hear someone say something like, don't listen to that politician. Everything he says is just a bunch of rhetoric. It's like, don't vote for him. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. It's not, those solutions aren't realistic. Something like that. Right? So it sounds good. It sounds persuasive. It sounds fancy, but it's not actually meaningful. This is not how we're using the term rhetoric in AP English language. We'll be focusing on acts that are intended to be persuasive and that are generally that do contain sincerity or substantial meaning. Now, how persuasive they are is something we can talk about in different contexts, but generally speaking, we will always go with the first definition of rhetoric in this course. A couple more terms you need. Rhetorical act. What is a rhetorical act? Well, this includes giving a speech, writing an editorial, constructing a research paper or persuasive essay, right? Essentially, doing anything with the intention of persuading someone of something, right? A rhetorical act is an instance of rhetoric, an act of rhetoric. So, rhetorical situation, therefore, is the context, the background of a rhetorical act. A rhetorical situation is made up of 7 elements, and the purpose of today's presentation is primarily to walk you through all 7 elements of the rhetorical situation. So, the first element is the speaker, also known as the writer, author, or rhetor. Rhetor is an old-fashioned term, but it still means the same thing, the person or entity engaging in a rhetorical act. Subject, audience, medium. Medium and genre are kind of the same thing. Medium is like the physical or visual form or auditory form of the rhetorical act, whereas genre is more like the category it falls into. More on that in a few minutes. exigence, purpose, and broader culture. So we're going to walk through these pieces in order, and I'm going to give you some clear definitions of them and some questions you might ask yourself when you're trying to determine these 7 elements of the rhetorical situation. And that is really my learning target for you here. I want you to be able to read a text and using detail and clear prose. I want you to be able to explain to me all of the elements of the rhetorical situation and show me that you understand how they're connected and how all of those things are important to the reading and understanding of the text. So, first, we need to look at the speaker, also known as the writer or rhetor. So, the speaker is the person, group, or entity producing a speech or text or engaging in some attempt at persuasion. The person or entity that is engaging in rhetoric. So the speaker is usually evident, especially in the texts we'll be considering in AP Lang. It's the speaker, the person giving the speech, or the person writing the piece is probably just going to be printed on the page. So you should ask yourself, though, not just who is writing this person, but why is this person writing this thing? That emphasis I've added, and that emphasis is important because, right, what is the significance of this person, right? What information about them can help me or could help you as the reader to better understand the text? You might need to do a little research, right? There's a reason why many of your teachers in your past English classes have spent a day or two talking about the life and the historical context of, or the life of the person who wrote the text and the historical context of the text you're reading, because all of this information helps you to understand, right, who the writer was and where they were coming from. So, subject is next. Subject answers the question, what topics is the speaker or writer considering? So there might be many, but when you read closely, 1 or 2 topics usually float to the surface as the most important or significant or accurate descriptions of what the text is about. So subjects can be lofty and abstract, almost thematic in nature. So you could have a nonfiction text and a rhetorical act that's focused on liberation, on human connection, on pride, on nationalism, on philosophy, right? On like really abstract concepts. You could also have rhetorical acts that are about very mundane and concrete things. Like if you were trying to convince someone that pepperoni pizza with pineapple is really delicious, that would be a rhetorical act, and the topic would be pepperoni pizza with pineapple on it, right? A text about the flu would have a fairly mundane, common subject. Subjects can also be really specific or really general. So you could have a general topic like climate change, or you could have a really specific topic under that category heading, like the ways we should respond to the international global impact of this one volcanic eruption in this one place on global temperatures on this one day. Super specific. Right? So the think about how general or how specific the subject is of the text you're reading. If you ask yourself, what is this text mostly about? You answer that question honestly and with evidence from the text, you will land on subject. The next piece here is audience. So, audience answers the question, who does the writer intend to have read or hear or consume this text in some way? We will call the answer to that question in particular primary audience, right? Who does this author have in mind as the person who is going to most readily consume the text? Who is the first person they have in mind when it comes to the consumers of that text? Now, There's another question here, though. Who else might the writer have to consider when producing a text? As in, who do they have to think about, even if this is not necessarily who they intend to read it or who they imagine will be reading it first? So the answer to that question is the secondary audience. So an example, maybe if someone, I'm thinking of Ijeoma Oluo's book, So You Want to Talk About Race, right? It's clear to me that the intended audience, the primary audience of that text for her is white Americans, right? People who are not African American, people who often who mean well and who want to avoid at all costs, right, saying something that offends other people or that is unintentionally, might even unintentionally be racist, right? That is her audience. However, she's well aware that someone who is African American might pick up her book and might read it and might have an opinion on what she says and how, right? So the African American community would be the secondary audience for that book. Now, the audience is not simply anyone who reads and picks up the text, and this is important to know because an author can't possibly think about every possible person who might pick up a text, right? That would be too many audiences to consider as they write. Authors, though, might still sometimes make decisions about their texts, knowing that a much wider group of people in their community, outside their community, in the world, and throughout time might someday read their text. Thinking of the Constitution here, I think even though the framers of the United States Constitution could not have imagined the world in 2020, they certainly they certainly thought that the government they created could last a very long time, and they wrote the Constitution knowing that the words on that page would be important for a long time and would be read by people very different than they were later on. So there's this dude, and his name is Lloyd Bitzer. He is a very well-known writer about rhetoric, and he wrote in this journal online, academic journal, Philosophy and Rhetoric. He argues that the audience is only those persons who are capable of being influenced by the piece. So if something is written, if there's a rhetorical act, and the person reading or consuming that rhetorical act has no stake in it at all, it's totally irrelevant to them, then that person would not be the audience of that rhetorical act because they are not able to be influenced by it. So when you come across a text, and you're trying to figure out the audience, ask yourself, who would the author want to read this text and why? Right? Who might the author be considering as a potential reader of the text despite not being the primary audience? And why these people? You should be able to defend your choices and explain why you think this is the primary audience and why you think that is the secondary audience. So when we put the pieces you've seen together so far, you can see that there are relationships, important relationships to consider between audience, speaker, and subject. We call these relationships Aristotle's rhetorical triangle, and this is taken directly out of your textbook. So relationship between audience and speaker. The speaker probably knows some things about the audience, their primary and secondary audience that they're thinking about as they speak or as they write. The audience probably knows some things or will try to learn some things about the speaker as they write. The relationships between speaker and subject are important as well, right? The speaker is going to know some things about the subject or not, and that's important. And most of all, right, the audience is going to know some things about the subject. So you can think about how, if the audience thinks the speaker knows some things about the subject and the speaker doesn't realize that the audience knows some things about that subject or some things or doesn't know other things, right? It can create really interesting rhetorical relationships. If the audience has more or less information about the speaker and subject, or the speaker has more or less information about the speaker and subject, then The audience might be more or less persuaded by what the speaker says. The speaker may be more or less satisfied by their audience's response to the text that is produced. All right. Next piece here to look at is medium. So the medium is the auditory, visual, or linguistic means by which the writer's ideas about a subject are conveyed. Okay, bunch of fancy words there. So auditory, right, something that is heard. So a spoken word, something in a spoken word form, like podcast or radio broadcast. Visual, right? So this includes images, billboards, paintings, right? Things of that nature. And then linguistic, anything that's written, essentially, written or communicated with printed words. So here are some media being plural of medium, that you might see on the AP exam. You'll see speeches, written versions of speeches, of course. You'll see letters. You could see letters. You could see essays. You could see editorials and opinion pieces, so rhetorical acts or works in the genre category of journalism. You could see images and print advertisements, especially in that synthesis question, the first free response question in part 2 of the test. Now, there are a lot of other rhetorical media as well, though. Lots and lots of things. Pretty much anything that someone produces and publishes, if intended to persuade, even if implicitly, would be a rhetorical act. And so the medium, the sky's the limit when it comes to media, right? So tweets are rhetorical media, or can be. Social media posts in general can be rhetorical media. Videos, video advertisements, rhetorical media. Ads in particular are interesting because they usually have a consistent purpose, to sell something. Now, billboards, right? Pay attention to billboards. We'll look at more of them later because they're just so rhetorically interesting. Political signs, right? Political signs in yards. So I walk around my neighborhood in Palo Alto and I see different political signs, different signs that have different rhetorical purposes all the time. Political signs in hands, in protests, right? All of those have all of these elements of rhetorical situation, and so therefore, and they're trying to convince you of something, and so they are rhetorical acts. Hats can be media, right? I'm thinking of those Make America Great Again hats, right? They are, each of those is a tiny little red rhetorical act, right? They are trying to convince you that that Donald Trump and his administration can, or number one, that America has lost some greatness, and that Donald Trump and his administration could restore that greatness. Whether or not you believe that is, of course, your own opinion, but it's important to think about what those hats and their rhetorical situation. So when you're trying to figure out the medium, you should ask yourself, why did the rhetor choose this medium to express these ideas, and what relationships exist between the medium, the speaker, and the subject? So exigence. Exigence is the specific momentary situation that requires or compels a person to produce a text. So here's our dude Bitzer again. Right? He defines the exigence as a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be in the world, right? So a rhetorical exigence exists when discourse, that's another word for debate, can, in the mind of a writer or speaker, impact the situation, impact the world situation in some way. So here are some examples. I think exigence is best understood not with definitions, but with examples. So I'm at Thanksgiving dinner with my family, and someone at my family says, why should I vote for that candidate? And I now have to explain, I have to make an argument for why the candidate mentioned is someone that should be voted for. So I was asked that question, and now I have to engage in a rhetorical act. The question asked by my family member was the exigence of my argument for voting for that particular candidate. Here's another example. You're renting an apartment. One morning, you wake up and there's no hot water. You would probably immediately get on the phone and call your landlord and say, it's January and it's 31 degrees in the house and there's no hot water and this is really uncomfortable. Please send someone and fix this now. So the exigence of that argument to the landlord about why this needs to be fixed right now is the fact that there's no hot water. That's the exigence. Also, Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail, this is a text that we'll look at later this year, was a response to a bunch of local white religious leaders in Birmingham condemning King's work in the civil rights movement in their city. So they wrote a letter, an open letter in the newspaper that condemned King's work. King responded with the text we know as letter from Birmingham jail. So that letter written by the white religious leaders was the exigence for King's letter. So when you're trying to figure out the rhetorical exigence of something, you need to ask yourself, right? What happened right before this text that prompted it? What was the sparking event that prompted the text? Did the author or someone else explicitly say what the prompting moment or event or act was or not? And if they didn't say it, you have to then do some research, right? Look up the date of the text. Is the date interesting? Did something related to this text happen in the world that was particularly notable that you might be able to connect to the text and have a better understanding of its exigence? All right. And rhetorical purpose. This might be the single most important one of all. The purpose is the goal or objective of a rhetorical act. Typically, when we express purpose, it starts with the preposition to, and then a present tense verb, and then some expression making the purpose statement more specific. So, to persuade, that is to persuade someone of something, right? Or a synonym, right? To convince someone of something. You could also see to inform someone about something. To inform is not necessarily to convince unless you're informing for the purpose of convincing. So to inform could still be a purpose, but it wouldn't be a rhetorical purpose because that's not persuasion if you're just giving someone information. To explain something, right? If you're just explaining how to do something, for example, we call that process analysis. Unless you're doing that explanation in order to convince someone of something, it wouldn't be a rhetorical purpose. But if there's an underlying purpose to convince, then it would be. To criticize, another possible purpose. So I want you to think about purpose in the same way you think about theme or thematic message in a novel or short story. Right? This is like the big overarching goal of the piece. So purpose is not the same thing as exigence, and this is super important for you to understand. So consider the landlord example, right? If you wake up in the morning and there's no hot water and you're very frustrated, the fact that there's no hot water is the exigence for you picking up the phone and calling your landlord and saying, hey, there's no hot water. Here's why you should really send someone to fix this right now. You will argue that someone needs to come fix the hot water right now. And that argument or your goal there, your purpose is to get someone to come fix the hot water right away. So that's your purpose. The fact that there's no hot water is your exigence. That was the triggering event for you to engage in that phone call, which is your rhetorical act. So when you're trying to figure out the exigence of a text, you need to ask yourself, what did the author hope to accomplish through this text? What was the end goal? You can think of a timeline here, right? You have the entire timeline represents a text. At the very beginning is your exigence. And at the very end of the timeline is the purpose, right? The exigence is what happens right before the text starts, and then you read the text, and by the end of the text, you have everything you need to determine rhetorical purpose. Sometimes authors will tell you the rhetorical purpose right at the beginning. My goal is to convince you of this. A lot of essays do that, but not always. Sometimes it's not clear and you have to figure it out based on the evidence you're being given. Okay, one more piece. This is broader culture. So the broader culture in which a text is produced will impact all the other factors in a rhetorical situation. It's sort of underlying the other factors in a rhetorical situation. So broader culture can impact your audience, right? It generally in a specific place or in a specific culture, you maybe not so much in the United States because we are a particularly diverse place, but in other places in the world, there might be some consistency in the cultural norms and values of the audience, which may or may not be different from the cultural values and norms of the person engaging in the rhetorical act. So it's important to consider, right, what knowledge and perspectives and norms and thoughts will people from some culture other than that of the writer bring to the reading or consumption of that rhetorical act, especially with respect to the subject. So is the medium appropriate for the culture, right? Are people accustomed to being communicated with in that particular way? Is it normal to convey political ideas in a written work instead of a public speech? Is it more appropriate to convey those ideas in person or in small groups than it is to broadcast them to a wide audience? Will someone think, will that take away from your credibility as a speaker if you deliver these ideas in this particular way in that culture because it's not the norm, right? You have to ask yourself all these questions. Given the norms, the cultural norms of the place where an audience is, right? Will they understand your purpose? Will they understand your exigence? Will those connections make sense to them? And if not, what can you do to help bridge those cultural norm gaps? You have to ask yourself, right? When you're looking at a text, what should I know about the cultural norms where this text was published? What should I know about the cultural norms where it was most widely consumed or discussed or considered? And what impact might all these pieces have on the reading of the text? So when we put all the pieces together, we get this lovely colorful diagram. So you can see you have the basic pieces of Aristotle's rhetorical triangle as three colorful circles, right? You have writer, subject, and audience. When you're considering the relationship between writer and subject, that relationship gives you your exigence, right? It tells you, why is the writer writing about this thing, right? What's going on there? What happened that made the writer feel the need to say something about this particular subject? Purpose represents the relationship between the writer and audience, right? What is the author trying to get from the audience? Are they trying to convince the audience of something? Are they trying to inform the audience of something? Like, what is their goal there? And then genre or medium, I think medium is a better term there, is how the subject is presented to the audience. Is it an essay? Is it a speech? Is it a tweet? Like, what is it? And then you'll see in the background there, you have the very light green circle, and that represents broader culture. So that underlies everything, and all of the different pieces of rhetorical situation can be impacted by the cultural norms of the place in which the text is written or published or consumed, or all three. If all three of those are different, well, that would be something very interesting to think about when discussing the rhetorical situation. Alrighty, so that is all I have for you. If you are watching this video in September 2020 and you're one of my students, you'll be practicing with a text titled "For Teenager Hijab, a Sign of Freedom, Not Stricture" in our textbook. If you're not one of my students, you should practice, right? Find some texts, whether in your own textbook or somewhere else, and try to figure out all the elements of rhetorical situation and go deep, right? Try to find all the details, find all of the relationships between all of the pieces, and try to use your words to show that you have the deep understanding of how all these pieces are connected. Alrighty, thank you very much.